Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Lunchtime Learning webinar, the next in our Green New York series. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to join us today on a topic that we've had a lot of requests for, so I'm really excited to have our presenter here today talking about it. I know it's kind of a subsection of something we've talked about before with plastic pollution, and I'm really excited to hear more about kind of the microplastic aspect of it. A couple housekeeping things as we get started today. This webinar is being recorded. You can find it on recording of it afterwards on the Green New York website. In addition, everybody is on mute. If you have questions as we go along, please type them into the chat box and we will get to them at the end. So we will have time for questions, just type them in. In addition, next month's webinar is taking place on August 11th. That's a Tuesday at noon, and that is on greener garment cleaning, featuring the folks from the Pollution Prevention Institute. So that promises to be a really good webinar as well. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to today's presenter, Asher Pack from the Institute for Rivers and Estuaries at Clarkson University. Thanks a lot for being here, Asher.
Great. Thanks, Brendan. Thank you for having me, and thank you, everybody, for joining us. This is a topic I've spoken on quite a bit. Began researching microplastics in the Hudson in about 2017. I think of myself just as, my background as a communicator. I don't do primary research necessarily. I lead students in the field on field work on this topic, but don't publish on this necessarily. But what I do and what Beacon Institute does a lot is aggregate the scientific information coming out from a lot of sources and then try to put that in a digestible form for the public. So that's kind of how I see my role here. So I call this local solutions and watershed strategies. As Brendan mentioned, microplastics are inextricable from the plastic pollution issue. We are going to be focusing more kind of on the micro level, and we'll get into more kind of what those distinctions mean. So I talked about the watershed level because if you're familiar with plastic pollution, you probably know that 80% of plastic pollution tends to come from surface pollution. So our watersheds are these big basins which catch a ton of pollution that happens within them. I hope that it probably seems like there are people here today from across the state, and so your watershed, and I like to think about this in watershed terms and a lot of the issues in watershed terms because it makes it more manageable, and it's something that citizen scientists and community members can do. They can help monitor these waterways and clean them up. So it's kind of empowering, and so that's why I like to use that lens. Here's just an example of impaired waterways. This is from the DEC website Mapper. I ask, I'll just ask the group what you notice about this map. What you're probably seeing is that, the impaired waterways tend to be where the populations are. And that's very true of microplastics as well, with plastic pollution and microplastics incidents as well. Just a bit of background about Clarkson University Beacon Institute. We're based in Beacon, New York. We do a lot of work here on Dennings Point. We're located in Dennings Point State Park. We do public programs and P12 programs. We serve about 3,000 students and 3,000 visitors each year. We do work on microplastic field work with our high school students, and we do a lot of education around that. Clarkson and SUNY ESF were recently designated a New York State Center of Excellence in Healthy Water Solutions. And I just wanted to note that we are expanding our location here on Dennings Point with a new environmental education complex, the construction beginning actually this week. And so we're hoping that this will allow us to expand Clarkson's contributions to this area of emerging contaminants. Here's just an example of students doing some microplastic field work. This was on Fishkill Creek here in the Hudson watershed. Students are using plankton nets to collect samples, and then they look at them in the science lab. And you'll see an example of films which we found, which tend to be from degraded plastic bags. And so this was right in our own backyard. And as I mentioned, local solutions and watershed focus. This is something that you can engage your local community in to really show where this problem exists. Another thing that we do here, we have an art gallery, again, on the theme of science communication. This was from an art project that was communicating plastic pollution, and just a couple of the selections from that. So, you know, this problem is multifarious, and so the solutions need to be as well. And arts and science are really important to communicating these issues to the public and can be very powerful. So what is the scope of the problem here in the Hudson? So I use the Hudson as the example because it is the water body that I focus on the most. I've also looked at some of the research on the Mohawk River as well. And, you know, based on, you know, population areas near similarly large rivers across the state, you're bound to see probably fairly similar numbers there. As you'll see from this, there's a range in terms of the number of particles per square kilometer in the water column. These numbers come from various organizations that have studied the water column. One I do want to highlight is the last one on this list, which is the Rosalia project, which found 300 million microfibers per day estimated to be in the water column of the main stem of the Hudson River. We'll come back to that later, but I just want folks to keep that microfibers in mind as we go forward. One of the ways in which we see what is floating in our rivers is by doing beach cleanups. Here is some data from New York, New Jersey Harbor Estuary Program. Just in terms of the common things that they find on the beaches here. This is very common to beaches worldwide, as you've probably seen from you know, plastic pollution. And so a lot of these would be considered macroplastics, but as you'll see, microplastics come from macroplastics. Microplastics tend to degrade through weathering once they end up in the environment, and they become microplastics. But just to show that these things, you know, pictures that you've seen, you know, worldwide of kind of the ocean gyres that are full of plastic, and that, you know, that exists here as well in the form of, it mostly ends up on the beaches, of course, because we have rivers. These aren't sort of circular ocean currents, but they deposit these particulates on our beaches. So I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit and then go back. So what are microplastics? So they tend to be divided into about 5 categories. You have grains or beads, you have fibers there, films, which I mentioned can tend to come from plastic bags, fragments, and foams, right? So each one of these has different properties, and each one of them tends to come from a different kind of plastic. So there are about 7 or 8 predominant types of thermoplastics, as they're called. Thermoplastics are created by heating up granules of plastic, what they call nodules. They're also called, they can be called mermaid tears, which is interesting. But they're just tiny little beads of plastic, and they heat them up and they form them into different shapes. And that process is what makes them so difficult to break down. And it also, their chemical composition or their molecular composition kind of determines what kind of fragmentation or deterioration you're going to see from them. This just gives a sense of kind of common products and what type of plastic they come from. The type of product can be determinant of whether it's more insidious or not. Some of these products tend to float more than others. Some tend to sink, and they tend to gather in different places. And so, you know, this will be important as we kind of get into the solutions section later on. But the properties of these plastics are instructive of where you find them, and also of what the solution can be to mitigate them. So, how long until plastic disappears? Folks are probably already familiar with this. I think folks are probably going to be pretty sophisticated with this, but plastic doesn't technically ever fully biodegrade. Because of the heating and the chemical bonds that are caused by the thermoplastic creation process, the environment, natural processes can't ever actually break those bonds fully. So they just continue to break down more and more and more in the environment through weathering processes. And you'll see here a variety of products and estimated times that it would take them to degrade in the environment. Now, these can vary depending on how much weathering there is, where this thing gets deposited, where it gets carried to in the water column. But these can all be sources of microplastics, of course, except for the non-plastic items like the apple core and the socks and things. So whether it's primary microplastics, as they call them, which are mostly have been removed from the economy or are being phased out of the economy. Those things are like microbeads that you would find in personal care products. If there are any of those out there, that would be something to avoid for sure. Those would be primary microplastics. That is, they were created at 5 millimeters or smaller. So microplastic is defined as 5 millimeters or smaller. Secondary microplastics is anything that degrades over time. So which plastics float and which sink? So you'll see these various kinds of plastic, and they have different properties. So this is important because they get deposited in different places in the environment. Those bottle caps might float on the surface, and you might be able to skim them off the surface. Those polyethylene terephthalate soft drink bottles, unfortunately, are denser, and they can sink to the bottom. Unfortunately, as things sink to the bottom in the ocean or in a river, it gets cold, it gets dark down there. There's much less weathering process happening there. So that's actually going to take much longer for that thing to degrade than something that might sit on the surface for a long time. This will also come into play as we talk later on about mitigation strategies and wastewater treatment. So keep this in mind as we go on. So a couple of broad questions here. How can New Yorkers understand and address plastic pollution in waterways? And what can citizens and public managers do to support the mitigation of microplastic pollution? There's a couple of things we're going to address. I have a few more slides to get through, and then welcome questions on these topics. And it's a big, complex issue, and I think, like as I said, there's a number of strategies required to address it. Just as an example, up until recently, Dutchess County banned plastic bags in January, but up until then, about 100 million single-use plastic bags were used annually, and that's just in this county. So when you see that, those numbers of the microplastics found in our waterways, they seem high, but with the amount of plastics that we use all the time, it begins to be much more realistic. As we talked about, surface pollution is causes about 80% of the plastic pollution. So how does that happen, right? It blows off of the streets, it's overfilled trash cans, it's all of the things that you can see here. These things ultimately end up in the storm drains. And through this whole process of being weathered and being carried through the environment, they break down. The bonds tend to break. They just physically break down a little bit and eventually become smaller. So this is an estimate that comes out of Pace Law and Roger Williams, that one load of laundry can produce 700,000 synthetic microfibers. So as coming back to that that number that we saw, the 300 million per day in the Hudson River, keep in mind that the Hudson River has about 32 combined sewer outflows between Albany and New York City. So if you're not familiar, a CSO is a wastewater treatment plant that when there's more than an inch or two of rain in a short period of time, it will overwhelm the pipes in the treatment plant, and so the raw effluent will go into the waterways. And existing water treatment does take out a significant amount of microfibers, but if the water is untreated, then it's going back into the system, and can, you begin to see how many fibers could end up in the environment, given that so much of our clothing does have synthetic fiber in it. It's important to keep in mind here too that it doesn't need to be washed in order for fibers to come off. As we'll see later, fibers can be released from your clothes in any case, just through the wind, or just like they're in the air. So there are multiple vectors for microplastics entering the environment. So what happens when it enters the environment? It also has the potential to enter the bodies of animals and humans. So here's an example of the food chain in the Hudson River watershed, and your food chains around the state probably look very similar with slight differences in the species here. There have been documented cases in the oceans of plankton uptaking microfibers. So you can find these pictures online of plankton trying to ingest a microfiber and it getting stuck in the plankton. And that really, as many of you have probably seen these photos of birds in the ocean whose bellies are full of like macroplastic, like lighters and things like that, because they're attracted to them. This is the other vector for microplastics, where it just makes its way up through the food chain. And as people are probably familiar with bioaccumulation, as a fish eats a certain amount of phytoplankton, it gathers and concentrates a lot more of that material in itself, and that process continues up the food chain. So what about human health, right? So there are several vectors here, and as I mentioned, clothing can release these particles into the air. You see those microfibers kind of floating above the person's head there, and this is true. I've seen a statistic recently that humans consume up to a credit card's worth of plastic a day. I don't think it's quite that. I don't think it's quite on that scale, but it's certainly possible that this is a significant daily intake at this point. And keep in mind that research on this is still very new, and there is not enough information yet for scientists to be able to say with confidence what the effects on the human body are, because we've only really started studying this in the past 10 years in the environment, and only on human health maybe in the past 3 to 5 years. So there's not enough data yet to create a longitudinal study with conclusions about this. But we know, because of other types of particulate pollution and contamination effects that we've seen in the past, scientists are watching out for these types of effects, where these tiny particles floating in our waterways tend to attract contaminants, hydrophobic contaminants, which will attach to these little, microparticles. And then trophic transfer is a reference to the food webs, up through the food chain. And then, a human will eat fish or even rice or lots of other canned foods. As we're finding out daily, they're finding more and more of this stuff in our food chain, human food chain, as well as the environment. And then what could be the effects of that? Well, the plastic itself, that particulate in your body may have some physical effect. It may not, but if it carries with it these contaminants, then it could really have, these other more grave implications. But again, more study is needed on that. So that's the bad news, right? Now's the part where we talk about what can we do. One of my favorite charts is the US EPA pollution reduction triangle. This starts at the top with the most effective things that you can do at the top, and then sort of the least effective at the bottom. The top is talking about source reduction and reuse. So what would that mean in this case? That would mean less plastic going into the environment, right? That would mean that 80% of plastic that is coming off of the surface, runoff, it would be reducing that. Recycling and composting, recycling still has a huge role to play here. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but, reduce, reuse, recycle is still a very important mantra. At the bottom there, you'll see treatment and disposal. So that's the kind of thing that after it's in the environment, then we're going to collect it, we're going to trawl it, and we're going to, that's the kind of thing that it requires kind of the most energy, and it has kind of the least effect, just because, your effect is temporary. You're going to clean those things up, but those beaches or those waterways are going to be fouled again in a small amount of time. However, I don't want to just leave that aside and say that's not effective or not important. Again, I think a whole suite of solutions here is warranted. So local solutions, alternative single-use products. So we'll talk a little bit about what are the other options for true biodegradable plastics. There are some folks coming up with alternative options, and I think that we should see a lot more investment in that, and that would go a long way. With the current pandemic situation, single-use products are probably not going away anytime soon. So the mindset of, we certainly need to reduce the amount of single-use behavior that we have, but knowing that it can only go so far and that people's precautions are going to be there, and that certain things are single-use by definition, like certain medical devices and things like that. Those alternative, fully biodegradable single-use products are really important. Cleanups on waterways. Again, this is, this might be the bottom of the pyramid, but we do this here all the time. We have Riverkeeper here, which is the annual river sweep. Thousands of tons of plastic trash has been pulled out of the Hudson River, and that does have a great positive effect. I mean, certainly right here on Dennings Point, we have a north-facing beach, and it gets covered with macroplastic, every month, So we try to do cleanups as much as we can here, and those things really, they are effective. They may not be a systemic, change, but they are effective. Personal behavior, again, reducing single-use behavior, wastewater treatment. There are some options there that we'll talk about, and business participation as well. It's important to have people on board in terms of these innovations and supporting these kinds of evolutions of our economy so that we can have a healthier environment. Reduce, reuse, recycle, like I said. So this is just kind of reiterating those personal behaviors that can really be effective here. And this is one of the things I like about the microplastics issue, because there really is a lot that a single person can do to support this, even if you aren't setting policy or things like that. You are able to really influence this, and as you talk to others in your circles and your family and your friends, limiting these kinds of things, or highlighting when you see an overflowing trash can, contacting whoever that is who owns that trash can or something like that. These kinds of things, personal actions really can go a long way with this. So here's again, personal actions, ways to unpackage your life. This is something that probably most people will be familiar with, but no disposable straws and bringing your own cup, that kind of thing. These kinds of things really can go a long way. The shopping bag, and there have been bag bans now, and so some of this stuff, some of the policy is beginning to catch up with personal behavior. But again, I think that personal behavior has led this issue in a lot of ways, and I think that as much as people can continue to do that, we'll continue to make progress. This just shows the kinds of effect. So if you don't believe me about replacing one disposable cup for a day, for 1 year, can have this huge effect, right? 16 pounds of solid waste that you're keeping from going into the environment. More information on this you can find at rethinkdisposable.org, and then Greenpeace.org has a great place to look at what is my plastic footprint. So that can help you kind of identify, sort of indirect effects. So looking again at local solutions, and I know I've got about 5 minutes left here. Local solutions, again, these are things sort of at the bottom of that pyramid, but look at how effective they can be, right? These things can really collect an enormous amount of trash in a small amount of time. And citizens can participate in this type of thing by advocating for this kind of thing, and then working on, volunteer teams to help load this stuff out. This is also something that can be, advocated at municipal or county government levels. Looking at stormwater and wastewater retrofits, these things are fairly, there's a range here from fairly simple to much more complicated. Just grates over your, your outflows here can be very helpful. Those nets over those outflows, of course, they have to be regularly collected at that point, but these are ways of kind of putting that stopgap in place. There's also an example here of like a centrifuge that would be able to reduce a lot more of that kind of heavier stuff that falls to the bottom. Here's some success stories. Again, we talk about that bottom of the pyramid, that collecting once it's in the environment, but the estuary program, New York and New Jersey floatables program, has actually really started seeing a downward trend in the amount of floatable debris that they're seeing in their waterways based on their skimming project. So this skimming project going on year on year on year, eventually they have started to see some reduction here. Now, the reduction could be attributed to other things like behavior or other things as well, but it's good to see that there is some success stories out there, some positive progress that can be made. In terms of a more systemic, and this is like a little bit more of an institutional solution, membrane bioreactors. This is something that our Clarkson University wastewater treatment engineers like to talk about. This is one of the best, and as far as the scientific literature, this is one of the best possible solutions for a treatment plant. If you're going to do like a retrofit to a treatment plant. These tend not to be too expensive to install, but they're a little bit expensive on the energy side to run. So again, alternatives needed, and this is, not to endorse a product, I've never used this product, but this is a company that's based right here in Beacon, Lollyware, that is using seaweed to create a new kind of plastic. So 100% plant-based food-grade materials that can disappear through composting or natural processes. So this is just to say that, another future is possible, right? Like we have the ability to do this. So to the extent that folks can find and support these alternatives, that can be very important. This single use does not necessarily have to mean generating an unending amount of debris that never disappears, right? So, and I mentioned a couple of these things before, packaging, paint, medical devices, these things that we depend on kind of for our health and for cleanliness, that there are other options. On the regulatory side, we've seen bag bans. Other options to explore for communities might be a total maximum daily load for plastics and trash or floatables on rivers. There are ways in which the MS4 regulatory structure can be used to enforce this, and we may see more of this kind of thing happening in the future, and this comes back to kind of business participation as well, in that it's always good if the economy can kind of get a little bit ahead of regulatory measures that may come down, so that if there is a limit on the amount of floatable trash that gets placed on a waterway, everybody in those communities, those industries that use that waterway can kind of get on board to support that before that kind of regulation goes into place. So, and this is one I want to just focus on the watershed model for trash debris and plastic. This is another way that the community can help to contribute to this. Is if we create a model in your watershed of where the worst hotspots are, of where trash, debris, plastic, and microplastics seem to be entering the water column, whether we decide that's because of microfibers that are coming out of the treatment plants, or we decide that that's surface pollution that's coming through the pipelines, the outflows, whatever it is, if we're able to identify those things, then we can intervene in those hotspots and kind of make the most economical interventions possible. So communities can help with this, citizen scientists can help with this. So your personal behavior is really big, and then participating in those cleanups and just observing and helping to determine where the worst spots are, so that then we can advocate for solutions that are as economical as possible and that have the biggest effect as possible. Other solutions that we talk about here, we got to engage the next generation with the education, hands-on, solution-oriented things that's sort of what we focus on with those high school students, as you saw, so they can actually see that, and empowering people to kind of clean this stuff up in their own communities, arts communication, as I mentioned. In a sort of macro sense, again, in innovating the U.S. recycling industry and eventually creating a circular plastic economy. There's also other innovations out there like plastic to fuel. There are some technologies that are turning plastic waste into energy, which is exciting. And then true bioplastics like the seaweed lollyware that I mentioned that actually compost. So that's where I will end my welcome your questions, and thank you everyone for listening.
Yeah, that was fantastic. Thank you so much, Asher. So if you have questions, please type them into the chat box. We do have quite a few here that we'll start getting to. I always joke that those of us who work in sustainability are really fun to have at parties, because we always have the latest information and things on our minds, and this is an area that I had not really thought much about, especially the comment you made about how people have estimated that we're consuming a credit card's worth of plastic a day. But, I guess we eat 8 spiders here, so it's a lot of stuff we're consuming. So let's get to some of the questions here. The first one we have is, similar to HEPA filters for air particles, is there any kind of a standard for water filters that's been developed that is effective in trapping microplastics for non-commercial use?
I am so glad you asked. Again, this is a product that I don't use myself, but has been developed by a company, the Road Project, which studied microfibers in the Hudson River. They have something called the Coraball. It's CORA. It's kind of like a rubber ball that would go in your, I believe it's your washing machine, and maybe your dryer as well, but can collect fibers, and as it goes through the cycle, pull it out, and it just kind of attracts these fibers, I think, through static. So there are, that's a very kind of like hyper-personal way that you might be able to reduce your plastic footprint. Mm-hmm. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Yep. So you mentioned plastic to fuel or plastic to energy. What does that entail?
So that's one that I'm not, I haven't done a deep dive on. There are companies that are developing technologies to do that. I'm not super aware of the details. I think that they are, these are projects that are still kind of in trial phases. If you are interested, you could definitely email me. I can send you a couple of the links that I have. But those projects, as far as I can tell, very much in development still. There's another project that I'd mentioned. It's not necessarily a fuel project, but there's a research group, I think, in Germany that found a worm that actually has evolved to digest plastics, like the only organism on Earth that can actually digest plastics and break them down into component organic molecules. So So there might be, but they're just at the very beginning of that research. And so there's a couple of these kind of emerging technologies that are just very much at the beginning of the process there. So as far as like, having a panacea or a complete tech fix, yeah, I don't think we're there yet, but I'd be happy to share some information.
Mm-hmm. The next question here: do you know how much microplastics accumulate in groundwater systems and well water is compared to surface waters?
Sure. So it has been found in groundwater. I don't know about a comparative percentage, but it is going to be lower than you will find with the surface waters, partially because of the those size of particles that could travel underground, and because of the floatability, as I mentioned before. So those heavier particles are going to tend to gravitate more in the water table, and there have been found examples of microplastics in those areas. Keep in mind that if a bird eats something with microplastics in it, and then the bird poops near some place with a watershed that eventually that water goes into the groundwater. That is another way that these things get transported. So even if you live on a pristine piece of land without any plastic pollution around you, it's very possible that you'll find these particles there. They can travel in the air. So they have been found in groundwater. I'm going to make a note to do some more research in that area. But it would definitely be less than you would find in surface waters. But microplastics have been found present basically in every ecosystem on the globe, including Antarctica, and so they really are pervasive.
Mm-hmm. And just a comment here, we have had a lot of questions about the recording of this or the slides. The recording will be posted on the Green New York website, and that is ogs.ny.gov/greenny, all one word. And the next question we have here: do plastics that sink to the bottom of the ocean have less of a microplastic environmental impact than plastics that float near the surface?
So not necessarily. If I understand the question, you're asking if the denser plastics have as much of an effect. I would say, the example that we used, terephthalate, PETE, or PETE, as you see printed on a water bottle or soda bottle. That was the densest one that we looked at, and that is one of the most commonly used plastics. So that is, a very, that does break down, and I think that just illustrates, that illustration was just to show that basically if plastic makes it out to the ocean where it can really sink below water table, and like in a river, there are episodic events where most of the deposited, say, on the north shore of Dennings Point here, will happen during an episodic event. And episodic events, or big rainstorm or anything like that, churn up the bottom of a river. And so even if that floats to the bottom of the river, it's going to get churned up, and it's going to go back into the water column with any kind of significant event like that. And it will get beaches, and it will float on the surface for a while and get out to the ocean eventually. So so those things, and also keep in mind that your benthic macroinvertebrate population, your tiny organisms that live in the substrate or the bottom of the river, as they consume those things that are sitting down there, that eventually makes it up through the food chain. So I wouldn't necessarily say they're less damaging. I think there's potential there, if I understand your question, there's potential there, like if you were to be able to find a hot spot where a lot of the plastic is settled to the ocean floor, of maybe cleaning up patches like that, because you probably have patches like this on the ocean floor, just like you have like those in the ocean.
Mm-hmm. We've got a comment microfibers and all of the PPE that is going on with the ongoing COVID situation here, a lot of disposable masks and gloves and things like that. Do you have any thoughts on what you've seen in terms of the rivers you've been looking at and the microfiber potentials of those?
That's a great question. I had not. It's a great question, and it's an intense time. I will say, just being a caretaker of the park here, I never saw medical masks as part of the trash on the before, but in the past several months, it's become a common piece of trash to find on our trails now. Usually, you would find doggy bags and big balls and things like that. Now we find masks on the trails pretty regularly. So, certainly as the use of these things increases, people drop them, they fall out of their hand, they fall out of their pocket, and those things they are probably going to add to the load on the environment. But as far as alternatives in that case, I think obviously we have a way to go. So I don't have a ready solution for you.
Mm-hmm. Has there been any research on accumulations in headwaters versus drainage areas? For example, the upper Hudson's headwaters in the Adirondack versus the Hudson River down near New York City?
Mm-hmm. Yes, definitely. As you see, as you look at these research papers, there is, I will say, much more work being done in the lower Hudson and the upper Hudson. But they do, as much as they do find instance in every single tributary of the Hudson. There was a student here at Marist that studied 5 tributaries of the Hudson, basically found that every single, not only does every tributary have microplastics in it, but every single sample that he took had microplastics in it, had some amount of microplastic in it. So that's a really intense thing to consider. And I think that is true of headwaters as well. I find that these microfibers float on the air. They travel through the earth just as easily as the water. So it's definitely less. And certainly, like as I mentioned, it varies with population. So certainly as you get north of Albany and Troy, Schenectady, those things are going to be, it's going to be less. I will say though, consider the Mohawk River, which is just west of Albany, the capital region. Mohawk River, there's been some great work done by Union College that river there, and found a ton of fibers and beads and fragments that floating in the Mohawk as well. So there are these varying inputs from different tributaries, and it's certainly less, but there's less population. For the most part, the headwaters it's going to be less, but I would venture a guess that you will still find it in nearly every sample.
Mm-hmm. So you just mentioned something there, and this gets to another question that we got here is, are these microfibers or can they be airborne, and are there any risks of breathing them in?
Yes, we're bringing them in all the time. If you wear, I used to have a really cheap fleece piece of jacket, like a piece of clothing, and you could actually see the kind of like puffs that would come off it. This is true on a smaller scale of almost any polyester clothing. Some of the most recent work on microplastics is the airborne microplastics. In fact, if folks share with Brendan, I think the most recent one was a study done in national parks out in the West, and they're finding, floatable. They just put out collection pans out in the middle of national parks. And they found significant amounts of fibers just landing on these, small collection pans that they put out there. And so, it is absolutely happening, and most of us are probably doing it for most of our lives. We've probably been breathing it in. But as I mentioned, the science is really just catching up to that. It's really hard to see these things. These might verge on being called nanofibers or nanoplastics. I didn't address that necessarily specifically, but when you get down below a certain size, it's difficult to observe, let alone identify the nanoscale plastic. And so, you may not even notice these kinds of things entering. And as I said, we're still, science is still out on what the health effects of those things are. But almost guaranteed that, yeah, you're already breathing this stuff in.
All right, so no longer breathing, no longer drinking. And now this is just kind of going down the rabbit hole here because I find it interesting. So most skin creams and lotions come in plastic containers. Is there the ability for fibers to shed off that into the cream that gets absorbed into the skin too?
For the most part, no. In terms of that type of plastic, that tends to be that low density plastic, which holds together pretty well unless it's like really under some kind of bad weathering. What I will say is probably people are aware that fibers are every kind of bottled water that's sold around the world. Fibers have been found in your tap water and every kind of bottled water. There is some belief in the research community that some of the fibers that are found in those water bottles are coming off of the water bottles themselves. And that's probably due to, sunlight, weathering, just physical, abrasion, that kind of thing that happens. And then maybe just the quality of plastic varying production process as well. But that's the only product I'm aware of that, like, it's been shown that it sort of directly sloughs off into the product. As far as the personal care products, I don't believe so. But I haven't seen any research on it.
Okay. So the next question here, is there anything that somebody can do about laundry? Are there any kind of cycle changes? Doing less loads, if that helps or not, cold or warm? I think you mentioned there was a product out there, some sort of ball that people could potentially look at. Is there anything they can do that's simple in their own home?
Right. So the Coral Ball, again, yeah, CORA, the Coral Ball is that can help. I think that the best thing that you can do is try to purchase more natural fibers, is try to wear more natural fibers, and try to, then those would be the things going into your laundry production. It's pretty difficult to see how we could use the fibers coming off of synthetic clothing. I'm a textile expert, though, and there are probably, again, this is an opportunity, an industry opportunity for people in the industry. Maybe there are weaves, maybe there are methods that would be better for holding those on the clothing better. Maybe some processes that could be more effective at creating polysynthetic clothing that do not slough off as much. But as far as on the personal level, as far as I know, other than the kind of the Core Ball, maybe there's a kind of a filter you can buy. I'm not other than that, it's natural fibers. As you saw on my early slides, wool will break down within 1 to 5 years in the environment. It's an organic molecule, so it's much less problematic.
What is the biggest change you've made in your own life to reduce plastic use?
That's a great question. I think that the biggest change for me, well, until recently, was bringing my own bottle of Dunkin' Donuts every day, because I'm an admitted coffee addict, and that was kind of my biggest sort of single use before I adopted like just a reusable bottle. And if people don't know, yes, before the pandemic, you were allowed to bring your own to Dunkin' Donuts, and they would just fill it up for you. I think a lot of folks didn't even know that. Of course, now they have disallowed that. So I've begun, I guess now what I do, I've begun making a lot more coffee at home, which is not as good, but the prices we pay. But so I think that's just reusables is really big. A really big aspect. I try to just, in general, reusable bags, reusable cups. I know it sounds simple, and I know it's one of those things that's been out there for a long time, but it's also one of those things that it does require a little bit of like thinking ahead and kind of personal organization, kind of thinking through your day or your week before you go out, making sure those reusable things with you when you go to the stores. Those, have become an issue now. But for me, I would say, yeah, that's kind of the biggest thing that I've done. Other than just spreading the word and sharing this knowledge with other people, which I would definitely encourage everybody to do. That everyone is an educator. That's an attitude that we have here at Beacon Institute of Clarkson. It's one of the principles we live by, and I think that talking about this stuff and just noticing it and helping other people find those solutions as well is also a huge impact that you can have too. That really geometrically enhance your.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. One of the things that I did last year around holiday time is put together little utensil kits for people and to them as part of holiday gifts. And there's some folks that are not don't do a lot for the environment on a regular basis, don't talk about it, and they've become enamored with them, and they've told me about them and done other things. So even the smallest thing that you can do for somebody or talk about have a big impact.
Reusable straws are great.
Mm-hmm. We've got time for just a couple more questions here, and they keep coming in. Did the Rosalia Project release a report on their Hudson River study?
Yes, they did. I believe you can find it from their website. If you find it, just let me know. Rachel, who runs the project, is a wonderful person, very open, and they're based in Vermont. And we're hoping to collaborate with them on future projects. So if you are interested in more information from them, yeah, just let me know, and I'd be happy to get that to you. But yes, I do believe that they published that. I don't have it necessarily right at my fingertips, but you can find a lot of these reports out there. New York, New Jersey Baykeeper was the other one that did a big report. I think it was with the Lamar Institute. They studied the bay and the New York City harbor. Rosalia, I believe, did the whole column. So if you're curious about north of Albany, I believe they did go north of Albany as well and did the entire Hudson River, from Mount Marcy all the way down to the bay. They were primarily focused on fibers, but so that's a good one. Clearwater, I mentioned, Riverkeeper as well. So there are a bunch of studies out there, and if folks are interested in the primary research documents, feel free to reach out to me, and I can share those with you.
Mm-hmm. And the final question we've got time for here today is, can you repeat the website where people can go to learn more about their plastic footprint? And do you have thoughts on doing kind of a plastic audit? Well, I know we usually talk about waste audits, but if you have any for folks on specifically looking at their plastic use.
I love the plastic audit question. That sounds like a great opportunity space. But it was greenpeace.org, and I think if you just Google plastic footprint or what is my plastic footprint, it was greenpeace.org that had that. Rethinkdisposable.org is another one that has a great website about things that you can do in your own life to reduce that single-use behavior, and also really because they have those infographics about the kind of impact that you can have, the kind of impact that does have. Remember, like I said, if you just avoid one single-use cup a day, that's 16 pounds of trash per year. And that's, again, something that you can share with other people. Those are great stats that you can share with people, because that single-use thing is just that it's sort of that thing that you can do every day, and it doesn't seem like a big thing. But when you communicate the positive effect that they can have by changing their behavior, that can be really powerful. So I encourage, both of those websites. But I love the idea of a plastic audit. That's something, I'll write that down too. And just thank you, everybody, for your great questions. And this has been really good for me as well to participate in this. So thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks a lot for presenting. This was fantastic, and for staying around for the questions. We had quite a bit of really good engagement today. And for everybody, thank you for joining. We do have our next Lunchtime Learning series coming up again. That's August 11th. That's a Tuesday at noon, and that's going to be on greener garment cleaning. So mark your calendars. Thanks, Asher, and thanks a lot, everybody. Have a good one.
Thanks, Brendan.